Good morning. Welcome back to the Adult Bible Class. We're going to wrap up the rise of Islam this morning, and we're going to be looking at the contributions of Islam really to the world, but specifically how they contributed to this movement known as Scholasticism that we have been slowly building up on. You'll notice after today I've reversed the rise of the Pope or Papism and the Crusades, only because the Crusades simply would not make sense without understanding the power of the Pope. So we really do have to do that in that order, in spite of what I was thinking or wasn't thinking before. So same resources as last week. Again, we'll be primarily leaning on Herald McKinley's Persia, the Rise of Islam and the Holy Roman Empire. We'll be looking a little bit at Peter Sarris's chapter 7, Heraclius, who was the Eastern Roman emperor that really had the most success pushing back against Persia and the Arabs. So that'll be in the review part. So nothing really new to cover, just two topics. I don't know if it will be short, but it could be short. It just depends on how much we cover. So we'll review what we've gotten so far, and then we'll look at the contributions of Islam. Would you join me in prayer? Lord, I just ask that this time together, as we are considering the way you have moved in the world and guided history and allowed different movements to come up and press against your kingdom and shape your kingdom and truthfully purify and bring about godliness in your people that we see happen over and over again in Scripture, and we see happen in history of the New Testament and in the New Testament times. Father, I just ask we would be aware of how we are approaching your word and the influences in our own backgrounds. And I thank you that this time of considering history contributes to that for us, that we might rightly divide the word of truth. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So if you recall, the rise of Islam was, the door to that was opened up because the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, was constantly at battle with the Sassanid Empire in Persia. And they actually used two kind of servant kingdoms to act as their warring classes against each other. And as that reduced the political power of both the Byzantines and the Sassanids in the region, the Arabic traders, Traders, not traitors, really rose into that power vacuum in the Arabian Peninsula. And when they did, they rose up with a strong sense of monotheism. That is, they believed in one God. If you recall, the big concerns, the big struggles in Christianity had to do with defining God. How do we have one nature, God, one being, God, but three persons within that Godhead? And then secondarily, if Jesus is human and he is God, how do you merge two natures into one person? And so this created different heresies, and these were especially prevalent in the Arabic Empire or Arabic region. In that Persian region, we remember things like monothelitism. That is, they said that Jesus had only one will, that he did not have a human will and a divine will, or monophysitism. He had one nature, that somehow the beingness of God overwhelmed the beingness of his humanity, and he was then only divine. And that gave rise to heresies that he only appeared to have a human body. Or they said that the divine and the human mixed together, miaphysitism. Remember, that term is what the Eastern Orthodox holds to, that there's some blending, and it gives rise to really this tertium quid. We use that word, this third thing. So all of these heresies played out because of the desire to understand how we could be saved. How is it ultimately that we are saved in Jesus Christ? If he isn't fully human, then some part of us is not redeemed on the cross. If he isn't fully divine, then his sacrifice only counted for a human, right? It's not an infinite value. So these are very important concerns that gave rise. And so this concern over monotheism, one God, is what really drove the religious character of this Islamic conquest. And that was the initial concern. And their influence rapidly spread over all of North Africa, up into Spain. Remember, we talked about Gibraltar is the rock of Tariq, right? The general, Gibber al-Tariq. And he's the guy that crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, burned his ships, and said, we're fighting or dying, right? There's no way back. And then they got reinforcements, and they went up into Spain, and they made it all the way back toward the east as far as what would become France, where Charles the Hammer, Charles Martel, stood his ground at the Battle of Tours. But they didn't just spread that way. They tried to push north into Byzantine, and they made it as far as Byzantium or Constantinople. They were unable to defeat the defenses of Constantinople, in part because of what they called Greek fire, this form of really napalm, this early form of napalm that they were able to spray out over the ships in the Bosphorus, the Arabic invading ships, and over the armies. And what we'll learn in the Crusades is the Fourth Crusade. It was Western Christians that actually came into Constantinople, that weakened the defenses of Constantinople, that ultimately resulted in its fall in the 1450s. But they did spread also east, over through Persia, through Iran, through Iraq, into India. And so this began in the mid-550s with this movement, and by 661, the dynasty of the Umayyads changed their perspective from a religious zeal to one that really focused on mercantilism and trade. And so what happens now is you have this people group that's spread across a vast part of the world, but they have no central identity. They were formed, as an Arabic group of individual clans that were bound together under strong leaders. And it appears that at some time in the middle of the 9th century, the 850s, that Muhammad al-Bukhari, who was a leader in the Abbasid Caliphate, in a desire to come up with a national identity, really created this story about a prophet Muhammad who had received the word of God in a cave. There is no actual evidence that the city of Mecca even existed in the 5th, 6th, 7th century. We saw that the first reference up here talks about trade coming from India was going through the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. Why would they unload ships at the southern end of the Arabic Peninsula, move them 5 miles inland and a mile in elevation so that they could then travel by camel across the mountaintops just to move back down a mile, back toward the sea 5 more miles, right? Like, that is nonsensical. There are no maps. There's no evidence. There are no Arabic writings that talk about this guy Muhammad as a prophet. It seems to be a whole cloth fiction that was made up to give a national identity, kind of like the George Washington and the cherry tree, and I cannot tell a lie sort of. This adds to the character of the leader of our nation, right? And so there are 3 Syrian, or Syriac is the language, references to a person named Muhammad from the 7th century. The first is actually in a writing called the Chronicle, composed in AD 640. And what it is talking about the Persian invasion of the eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, where King Heraclius, that was the emperor, the chronicle calls him a king, but he was an emperor. And the specific writing is there they negotiated the terms of peace, and the Euphrates was recognized as the frontier between them, the Persians and the Romans. Thus they made peace with each other. On Friday, the 4th of February, at the 9th hour, there was a battle between the Romans and the Arabs of Muhammad in Palestine, 12 miles east of Gaza. The Romans fled, leaving behind the Patricios, that is the leader, the son of Yarden, whom the Arabs killed. Some poor village people of Palestine, and every time I read that, I think of the YMCA, right? Not those village people, but some poor village people of Palestine were killed there. Christians, Jews, and the Samaritans. The Arabs ravaged the whole region. The Arabs invaded the whole of Syria and went down to Persia and conquered it. The Arabs climbed the mountain of Mardin and killed many monks there in the monasteries of Kedar and Benotho. There died the blessed man Simon, doorkeeper of Kedar, brother of Thomas the priest. So we have an indication in the 7th century that there was an Arabic general or an Arabic war leader by the name of Muhammad, but that is a far cry from the story of a man marrying, this rich elderly tradeswoman who then gets this vision from God and passes down the Quran. In fact, in Peter Sarris's writing, on page 20 of chapter 7, he says, paradoxically, given his subsequent significance, speaking of Muhammad, the historical figure of Muhammad is a relatively shadowy presence in the pages of the 7th century sources. Perhaps the earliest reference we have to him, or at least to a prophet who had arisen amongst the Arabs, is to be found in the so-called doctrines of Jacob. And this doctrine of Jacob was a Jewish guy who was being forced into Christianity by the Eastern Roman emperor. And he doesn't actually mention Muhammad by name. He says, and I, Abraham, made inquiry and learned from those that had met him that you find nothing true in the, quote, so-called prophet, save shedding the blood of men. For he says he holds the keys of paradise, which is untrue. And then he continues, at that time, circa 619 to 620, a certain man from amongst those same sons of Ishmael, remember the Arabs are not Isaac's descendants, but Ishmael's descendants, whose name was Mahmet, a merchant, as if by God's command appeared to them as a preacher and the path of truth. So here we have in Syriac, this Syriac is the language of the Persians. It was adapted from Aramaic, which was the biblical language in Jerusalem, talking about a guy who's a merchant named Mahmet, who also claims to be a preacher, who claims to have known. So we do have that. And then the third source is something in the Armenian history, which does give some details of the Arabic tradition. But what it looks like is they've got this character that was found in some writing that was in the native language of the Arabs that was then leaned on to create this character and give the national importance. So that is where we have come so far. But what is it that the Arabic nation actually contributed to the world? Well, the first thing is they were incredibly powerful and organized rulers and conquerors. The caliphs saw to it that they governed their nation effectively as they conquered people. They put a tax on them. They left their ruler in place, and the non-Arabs actually had to pay a higher tax than the Arabic people. They built safe roads. They provided a very safe form of trade. They standardized a currency that was stable. And they also, residents of maritime lands or riverside areas saw the desert as a dangerous and impenetrable barrier, But for the Bedouins, the Arabic traders, they had developed a way of transiting the desert, primarily by camel. Anybody familiar with camels? Nasty creatures. So let me just kind of read this to you about camels out of the book here. It says, the rapid growth of Islamic trade was rooted not only in the ingenuity of Arab traders, but also in the strength and bravery of the camel, the, quote, ship of the desert, so called because of its rolling, loppy kind of gait. The Bedouin of Arabia owed their lives and livelihoods to their camels. They were the first people to tame the animal, which they knew is an extremely tough creature that could survive in the driest of areas. The camel is outstandingly suited to serving humans in the desert. Although it does not actually live on less water than other animals, it needs to drink much less often than they do. It can easily go 3 or 4 days without taking in water and has been known to survive for 17 days without a drink. The camel can lose 25% of its body weight through dehydration. Lucky. In any other animal, such privation would cause lethal thickening of the blood. When a camel gets the chance to, quote, refuel, it does so very quickly, being capable of drinking 25 gallons of water in 10 minutes. Camels can survive on sparse, thorny vegetation, including twigs. They have long legs and soft, widespread feet, particularly adapted for walking on sand. To protect it from sandstorms, it has 2 rows of eyelashes on each eye and a protective hair in its ears. It can also close its nostrils. It can carry up to 220 pounds on its back for weeks at a time, and it's useful in other ways. The female camel produces milk with a high fat content. Camel's meat is edible, and its hide can be made into warm blankets that are essential on the cold desert nights. Even the camel's dung is useful because it burns easily in an evening fire. So, and of course, you know, there's 2 species, the one-humpers and the 2-humpers. So, because of that, because of taming it, they were very much able to provide trade. So this caravan, allowing for crossing of the desert and establishing safe roads and safe exchange of goods was an important contribution. Secondly, they were actually a naval power. So they didn't just ride the ship of the desert, they also traveled on the Mediterranean Sea. And you got to remember that at the time of the early 1st century, the sea was seen as a dangerous place, right? That storms would blow up in the Mediterranean, ships would get shipwrecked. We have records in even the book of Acts, right, of Paul being shipwrecked. Now, the Byzantine Empire was dominating the sea at the time, and the Arabs actually developed their naval power because they were seeking to be pirates. They wanted to plunder. But they soon realized that if they could control the sea, they could control trade through the sea, and that was a much wealthier and less risky proposition than trying to steal from others if you could just tax them, right? Ergo, we now have governments that tax us relentlessly. And the Byzantine Empire was barely able to defend even like the Aegean Sea there by Greece, the Bosphorus Straits. Arabs actually made it all the way to Ostia in Rome. That's where the Tiber River, the main river in Rome, lets out into the Med. So they definitely pressed their advantage and turned it into legitimate trade ships across the Mediterranean and developed several Islamic or Muslim harbors. Now, the relationship between the Muslims and the Christians was far too strained to have peaceful trade. But there was, through the Jewish merchants, a great deal of trade between the two. Sinbad, the sailor, right, comes from, is a story actually from 1001 Nights. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to philosophy and preservation of knowledge. So they were definitely gifted builders. Anytime you have a strong government, you open up the opportunity for tradespeople to focus on their craft, art, woodworking, stoneworking, painting, things like that. Some things that they developed or invented. The windmill comes from the Islamic people, that low human energy mechanism. They harness the power of the wind. Of course, their windmills used vertical shafts. They were not big blade things that freeze up in Texas. You may have heard of Toledo steel in Spain, right? The Cordoba and Toledo in Spain, the steel for those swords were refined and invented through the efforts of the Muslims in Spain. Their tapestries, their skill at weaving and knot tying and making rugs were second to none. They actually were better than the best out of the Byzantine Empire. If you've ever been to the Middle East, their carpets, Persian carpets, are world renowned for being high quality goods. So dye production and weaving. So very skilled inventors, builders, and very gifted tradespeople. They were also tremendously influential in philosophy and the preservation of knowledge. You all are familiar with Roman numerals, right? I, IV, right? V, L, X. What's missing in the Roman numeral is the concept of zero. You can't write 10 with a 1 in the tens place and a 0 in the ones place in the Roman numeral system. You basically have to do maths to understand what the number represents, right? Every time you look at the year in Roman numerals, it's like MCLVIX, and you're doing some kind of weird dance to figure out what in the world is the year. But you look at 2023 and you instantly know. So mathematics, and actually the Arabs didn't invent that. They borrowed that from the Indians. And this really happened during the Abbasid Caliphate. Their theology during the Abbasid Caliphate, that's called the golden era of Islam, by the way, the time of the Abbasids, when the story of Muhammad was really kind of hammered down. So their theology, they wrote these things called hadiths. A hadith is a canonical story about what Muhammad did or said, or his family did or said. And there's literally tens of thousands of them. And you don't know which ones are true hadiths and which ones are false hadiths, just invented. And so they then had to invent a system of kind of certifying which stories of Muhammad are good stories and which ones are bad stories. And they did that by kind of tracking the who said it and who told that person, who told that person, and who told that person. So it's all hearsay, but there's more reliable versions of hearsay and less reliable versions of hearsay according to their tradition. I mentioned that the story 1001 Nights. Have you ever seen the cartoon Aladdin by I guess it's Disney, right? There's an opening scene when Aladdin goes in and he meets the genie for the first time, right? Robin Williams, and Robin Williams sings the song, right? Well, Ali Baba had them 40 thieves, Scheherazade had 1,000 tales, right? But Master, you're in luck because up your sleeve you got a brand of magic never fails. You got some power in your corner. Rare fact, I know all the words to every song in Aladdin. Or at least I did at one point. So in the song, he makes reference to Scheherazade. And what's interesting is that every one of these people that he introduces in the song is kind of a preservation or salvation story. The story is that there was a Arabic prince who took a different wife every single night. And in the morning, he killed the wife. Well, when he takes Scheherazade as his wife, she tells him a story that's kind of like the Paul Harvey, but only up to the commercial, right? You don't get the rest of the story after the commercial. She promises she'll tell him the rest of the story the next day, and he's so intrigued by her stories that he lets her live. And after 1,001 stories, he finally relents and says, I guess I won't kill you. You're too valuable. Well, that story includes Sinbad the Sailor. It includes Aladdin and 999 others, right? So that is part of the Arabic tradition of literature. I already mentioned Indian mathematics. Also, economics were a big contribution from the Arabic community. The trade in date fruit alone, okay, dates, utilized up to 100,000 camels. So you think about the massive 220,000 ton ship, like the one that got stuck in the Suez Canal. Well, way back in the 8th, 9th, and 10th century, they were trading date fruits on 100,000 camels. Melon, sugar cane were almost equally important. And this went on for 200 years, from the 8th century through the 10th century, before really the decline started to happen. And as they declined, they really left in their wake a tremendous amount of extremely valuable information. Things like the Renaissance in the Western Empire would not have been possible without the information having been preserved by Islam. If you have ever read a Bishop's Bible or a Geneva Bible or a King James Bible, the Greek text that those are based on were preserved in Constantinople. And when Constantinople was defeated by the Arabs in the 1450s, the Christians there fled to places like Geneva in Sweden and brought with them their 10th, 11th, 12th century Greek copies of the New Testament. And that was what Erasmus had available to him as he decided which words belonged in the New Testament and which ones were variants, right? So this idea that it was a preserved text or a received text is also completely fiction. That was an advertising slogan on the 15th revision of that text through 3 different groups of people. The Elsevier brothers, even though they were actually uncle and nephew, they're called the Elsevier brothers, were no longer selling printed copies of their third revision of their Greek text. So they put this slogan on it saying it is the text received and corrected by all, and that's where that term, Textus Receptus, came from. But really that was only possible because of the Arabs pushing the Eastern Empire Christians out, right? By then, the West was completely reliant on the Latin Vulgate text of the Bible. The idea of credit, economic credit, was developed really in the Arabic world. If you wanted to go from Spain to, I don't know what's far from Spain, Alexandria, and you were going to buy tons and tons of wheat in Alexandria, what you did not want to do is take the chance of carrying all that cash with you. What did we have? American Express. What were those pieces of paper called? The people used to traveler's checks. Yes. So this idea of, and that really was then adapted by the West, and in the West in particularly, it was in the Roman Catholic Church where the Knights Templar, that's exactly right, who they would basically, you deposit your money with them in one place, they'd write you a note, right, with a serial number or whatever, and you take it to the next place, and they would send a separate communique to the next place that says, this is the numbers they need to get the money out from you guys, and they would travel and provide protection. Let's see, what am I missing? The city of Baghdad was, so we have kind of negative thoughts about Baghdad because of Saddam Hussein, right? But it was an absolutely beautiful, art-filled, grand mosque and palace that was at the heart of it. And it was incredibly beautiful and ornate, and the architecture was incredible. They made Damascus the center of trade, craftsmanship, and culture. It became the new capital city of the Islamic world. All the wealth was displayed in the streets, and craftsmen worked in the open air. Huge crowds congested the market, buying, selling, and transporting a range of goods. So think about a extremely vital city where the trade and the art and everything is happening right out front. It is incredibly powerful. Again, there's a story about Baghdad in the 1001 Nights as well, but actually several of them. Let's see. Baghdad was the richest place on earth, and merchant ships from Africa, China, and India docked on the city's wharves. So you think about the presence and power of the Islamic world. So that is as far as we're going to go today. Like I mentioned, it was probably going to be shorter. I was hoping to have fit this in on part 2, but we would have been here till 10:30 if we tried to do that. Plus, you got to hear me sing songs from Aladdin. Any questions about the influence of the Islamic world? Next week, we'll be talking about the rise of the power of the Pope. And the main theme, the most important thing to remember when we talk about the power of the Pope and the responsibility of us, as Christians, is to not allow theology to exist only in the pulpit or only in the elders. But theology proper must be held in the congregation and understood by the congregation, who then, because that's where God has given his authority and his power. And when you lock it away into the realm of the monastery or the seminary or only to the pulpit, errors get made that are not then corrected. So thank you for those who joined us online, and I will have a longer teaching, of course, next week. God bless y'all. We'll see you at 10:30.